The Soviet Union did not fall in a blaze of gunfire or a final battle. It did not end with enemy tanks rolling through Red Square or a flag lowered under foreign command. It collapsed in silence. The most heavily armed state on Earth simply stopped holding itself together. Think about that. A superpower built to endure nuclear war, mass mobilization, and endless sacrifice unraveled without a decisive blow. This is a paradox at the heart of the Soviet collapse. For decades, the system prepared obsessively for external conflict. It planned for invasion, for annihilation, for total war. Yet what destroyed it was not invasion, but exhaustion. Economic, political, and psychological exhaustion. The kind that does not explode. The kind that drains. To understand this collapse, it is necessary to discard the familiar image of empires falling in flames. This story does not begin on a battlefield. It begins in offices, factories, ministries, and apartments. It begins in balance sheets and supply plans. It begins in quiet compromises and growing disbelief. The Soviet state demanded obedience and sacrifice. In return, it promised security, purpose, and progress. For a long time, that exchange appeared to work. But beneath the parades and missile tests was a system that struggled to create value. It could command production, but not efficiency. It could mobilize labor, but not innovation. It could enforce loyalty, but not belief. Over time, those weaknesses accumulated. When growth slowed, the cost became impossible to hide. The stakes were enormous. The Soviet Union controlled vast territory, commanded the loyalty of satellite states, and influenced revolutions across the globe. Its collapse would reshape borders, markets, and lives far beyond its own citizens. This was not just the end of a country. It was the end of a system that had defined global power for nearly half a century. The central question was never whether the Soviet Union could fight. It had proven that repeatedly. The question was whether it could pay for itself, whether it could sustain the immense economic burden of its ambitions. Armies require fuel. Missiles require metals. Ideology requires faith. Economies require results. When those results failed to materialize, trust evaporated. By the late 20th century, the Soviet state was still standing, but it was hollow. Its institutions functioned, but without conviction. Orders were issued, but increasingly ignored. Production targets were met on paper, but not in reality. The system had become performative. Appearances mattered more than outcomes. This hollowing did not happen overnight. It unfolded slowly, quietly, and relentlessly. And hollow structures do not need a final blow. They collapse under their own weight. To see how this happened, imagine a city designed for permanence. Massive avenues, monumental buildings, statues carved to last centuries. From the outside, it looks immovable. But inside, the pipes corrode. The wiring fails. The foundations crack. The structure still stands, but its internal systems no longer function. The Soviet Union was such a city. Its power was visible. Its decay was hidden. The world saw tanks and rockets. It did not see empty warehouses, falsified reports, and a growing gap between promise and reality. The Soviet economy was built to mobilize resources for strategic goals, not to satisfy consumer needs. That distinction mattered. In wartime, it was an advantage. The state could redirect steel, labor, and energy overnight. In peacetime, it became a liability. The system produced what planners demanded, not what people wanted or needed. Over time, this mismatch created frustration. Shelves lacked basic goods. Quality declined. Waiting became routine. People adjusted, but belief weakened. When a system cannot deliver everyday competence, its grand narratives lose credibility. This erosion of trust had consequences. The Soviet state relied on compliance. Compliance depended on fear, habit, and belief. Fear can enforce behavior, but it cannot create loyalty. Habit can sustain routines, but it cannot inspire sacrifice. Belief is what turns obedience into commitment. As belief faded, the cost of maintaining control increased. Surveillance expanded. Punishments intensified. Yet these measures treated symptoms, not causes. They addressed behavior, not legitimacy. The more force the system applied, the more it revealed its insecurity. Externally, the Soviet Union projected confidence. Internally, it managed scarcity. This contradiction defined daily life. Citizens heard speeches about abundance while navigating shortages. They saw images of progress while using outdated tools. This gap between rhetoric and reality mattered. Over time, people learned to say one thing and think another. Official language lost meaning. When words no longer align with experience, cynicism spreads. And cynicism is corrosive. It does not rebel loudly. It disengages quietly. Economic exhaustion compounded this disengagement. The Soviet model required continuous growth to sustain its promises. Growth financed military spending, social benefits, and subsidies. When growth slowed, trade-offs emerged. Resources diverted to defense meant fewer goods for consumers. Subsidies had inefficiency, but drained budgets. The system borrowed from the future by postponing reform. Each delay increased the eventual cost. The state could no longer balance its obligations without strain. This strain was not immediately visible to outsiders. The Soviet Union still negotiated from a position of strength. It still fielded vast armies. It still influenced global events. But power projection masked internal weakness. The ability to intimidate abroad did not translate into resilience at home. In fact, External commitments increased internal pressure. Supporting allies, maintaining parity, and sustaining influence required resources economies struggled to provide. The gap between ambition and capacity widened. As this gap widened, decision-making became defensive. Leaders avoided risks. Innovation threatened established interests. Reform risked exposure. The safest option was to maintain the status quo. But the status quo was unsustainable. This created paralysis. The system could neither change nor continue indefinitely. It hovered in a state of managed decline. Think about that. A superpower trapped by its own structure. Unable to move forward, afraid to step back. Psychological exhaustion followed economic strain. Citizens adapted to shortages, but adaptation has limits. Over time, the effort required to navigate daily life increased. Informal networks replaced formal channels. Favors substituted for services. Corruption filled gaps left by inefficiency. These adaptations kept society functioning, but they undermined the system's legitimacy. When rules are bypassed to survive, rules lose authority. The state still existed, but it no longer governed everyday reality. This erosion mattered because the Soviet Union depended on centralized coordination. Its complexity required trust in information flows. When reports were falsified to meet quotas, planners lost accurate data. Decisions were made based on fiction. Errors multiplied. Each layer of bureaucracy filtered reality further. By the time information reached the top, it bore little resemblance to conditions on the ground. The system became blind. And blind systems make dangerous assumptions. Externally, rivals misread this blindness as stability. The Soviet Union looked formidable. Internally, its leadership struggled to diagnose problems. This disconnect delayed response. When reforms eventually came, they arrived late and incomplete. But that story belongs to later chapters. What matters here is a foundation. The Soviet collapse was not sudden. It was cumulative. It was a result of years of unresolved contradictions. The absence of final battle is not an accident. It is the outcome of a system that lost its capacity to mobilize belief. When the moment of crisis arrived, there was no one to defend the structure. Soldiers did not fight because they no longer understood what they were defending. Citizens did not resist because they no longer trusted the promise. Institutions did not intervene because they no longer believed in the mission. Force without legitimacy is brittle. It can intimidate, but it cannot endure. This is why the Soviet Union's end felt anticlimactic. There was no dramatic showdown, no decisive victory, just a quiet unraveling. Orders went unanswered. Borders shifted. Symbols changed. Life continued, but under new rules. The silence was telling. It revealed that the system had already died before it officially ended. What remained was a shell. Understanding the silent collapse requires a shift in perspective. It demands attention to economics as a hidden weapon, not used by enemies, but turned inward by the system itself. Debt, inefficiency, and misallocation eroded strength from within. The Soviet Union was not conquered. It was depleted. And depletion does not announce itself with explosions. It announces itself with fatigue. This chapter sets the stage. It frames the paradox and the stakes. It asks the central question. How does a superpower fall without a final battle? The answer lies not in a single event, but in a process that unfolded over decades, a process driven by economic realities and psychological limits, a process that turned strength into fragility. To understand how the illusion of invincibility was built and why it ultimately failed, it is necessary to go back to the beginning. For much of its existence, the Soviet Union looked indestructible. It rose from the wreckage of empire and civil war and transformed itself with breathtaking speed. In a single generation, a largely agrarian society was remade into an industrial giant. Smoke poured from factory stacks. Rail lines cut across frozen plains. Entire cities appeared where forests and fields once stood. To the outside world, it looked like proof that the system worked. The state commanded resources on a scale few could match. It promised certainty in a chaotic world. And for a time, it delivered results that were impossible to ignore. Central planning was the engine of this transformation. Prices, wages, trade, and currency were set by the state. Production targets were issued from above and enforced without negotiation. Nothing moved without approval. This rigid structure allowed the Soviet Union to concentrate power and act decisively. In moments of crisis, it was formidable. Resources could be redirected overnight. Labor could be reassigned by decree. Entire industries could be repurposed in months. In war, this ability was decisive. In peace, it created an illusion of permanent strength. The Second World War cemented that illusion. The Soviet Union absorbed devastation on a scale almost unimaginable. Cities were destroyed. Tens of millions died. Yet the state survived and emerged victorious. That victory became foundational. It validated the system in the eyes of many citizens and observers. If the Soviet model could withstand such destruction and still defeat a powerful enemy, what could possibly bring it down? Expansion into Eastern Europe followed. Strategic depth increased. Influence spread. The system appeared not just resilient, but superior. This perception mattered. Power is not only measured in weapons or territory. It is measured in belief. Belief that a system will endure. Belief that it represents the future. The Soviet Union projected that belief through parades, architecture, and ideology. Massive avenues and monumental buildings signal permanence. Military displays showcase discipline and scale. The message was clear. This state was built to last. Economically, the early decades reinforced that message. Heavy industry expanded rapidly. Steel, coal, and machinery production surged. The state prioritized sectors that signaled power. Tanks, aircraft, and ships rolled off assembly lines. These outputs were visible and measurable. They could be counted, displayed, and compared. The system excelled at producing what it chose to value, and it valued quantity over quality, scale over efficiency. This choice had consequences, but they were not immediately apparent. As long as growth remained high, inefficiencies were absorbed. Losses could be hidden within expansion. When output increases rapidly, waste is less visible. The system rewarded managers for meeting quotas, not for minimizing costs or improving design. If a factory met its targets, it succeeded, regardless of whether its products were useful. Over time, this created a culture of compliance rather than improvement. The illusion of strength was reinforced by control over information. Data flowed upward through layers of bureaucracy. At each level, incentives encouraged distortion. Missing a target carried penalties. Exceeding it brought rewards. The safest option was to report success. This created a feedback loop of optimism. Planners believed production was higher than it was. Leaders believed shortages were temporary. The system believed its own reports. Externally, the Soviet Union's position seemed secure. It achieved strategic parity with its main rival. It supported allies across multiple continents. Its currency did not float. Its prices did not fluctuate. This stability appeared to shield it from global shocks. While other economies faced cycles and crises, the Soviet system claimed immunity. Central planning, it argued, eliminated chaos. This narrative was persuasive to many, especially in a world scarred by depression and war. But stability came at a cost. By fixing prices and suppressing signals, the system blinded itself to reality. Prices are information. They communicate scarcity, demand, and value. When prices lie, decision-making suffers. In the Soviet economy, shortages did not raise prices. They lengthened lines. Surpluses did not lower prices. They filled warehouses. The system could not adjust organically. Every correction required administrative intervention. This slowed response and magnified errors. Consumer needs were secondary. The state focused on production goals aligned with strategic priorities. Everyday goods received less attention. Quality declined. Variety disappeared. Innovation stagnated. People adapted, but adaptation masked failure. Citizens learned to wait, to substitute, to rely on informal networks. These behaviors kept society functioning, but they also concealed the system's inability to deliver basic competence. Foreign trade provided a temporary release valve. The Soviet Union exported raw materials in exchange for hard currency. Oil, gas, and metals became lifelines. These exports funded imports of technology and grain. They allowed the system to postpone reform. As long as commodity revenues flowed, deficits could be managed, but this reliance created vulnerability. Raw materials are finite. Prices fluctuate. An economy dependent on them is exposed to forces it cannot control. Still, for decades, the illusion held. Growth slowed gradually, not suddenly. Problems accumulated quietly. From the outside, the Soviet Union still looked formidable. Its military remained massive. Its influence persisted. Its ideology retained adherents. The system's rigidity, which would later prove fatal, initially appeared as discipline. Its uniformity looked like unity. Its control resembled order. Internally, however, the cost of rigidity mounted. Innovation requires flexibility. It requires feedback, experimentation, and failure. The Soviet system discouraged all three. Failure was punished. Feedback was filtered. Experimentation threatened stability. As global technology advanced, the gap widened. The world shifted toward information services and efficiency. The Soviet economy remained anchored in heavy industry. Its tools grew outdated. Its processes lagged. The system's response was to intensify control. More planning, more oversight, more reporting. This added complexity, without improving outcomes. Bureaucracy expanded to manage inefficiency. Each layer increased delay. Decisions took longer. Adjustments arrived too late. The economy became a vast machine with no sensors. It moved, but it could not feel. Yet belief persisted. Many citizens accepted shortages as the price of security. Many officials believed reform was unnecessary. The system had survived worse. They argued it would survive this too. This confidence delayed reckoning. It allowed contradictions to deepen. It postponed difficult choices. The illusion of indestructibility was powerful because it was grounded in real achievements. The Soviet Union had transformed society. It had educated millions. It had defeated formidable enemies. These accomplishments were not imaginary. They created loyalty and pride. But they also created complacency. Past success became proof of future survival. Warning signs were dismissed as temporary setbacks. This mindset shaped policy. Instead of restructuring incentives, the state adjusted targets. Instead of opening information flows, it tightened control. Instead of encouraging efficiency, it demanded output. Each choice preserved appearances while undermining foundations. The system became better at looking strong than at being resilient. By the time growth visibly slowed, the illusion had hardened into dogma. Questioning the model was dangerous. Admitting weakness threatened legitimacy. The system defended itself against reality. But reality does not negotiate. It accumulates pressure. When adaptation is delayed, adjustment becomes more painful. This chapter is not about collapse. It is about confidence. Confidence built on scale, control, and past success. Confidence that masked structural weakness. The Soviet Union did not fall because it lacked power. It fell because the form of power it relied on could not evolve. The very mechanisms that enabled rapid industrialization later prevented adaptation. Think about that. A system optimized for mobilization struggled in a world that rewarded flexibility. A structure built for war faltered in peace. The illusion of strength was real, but incomplete. It showed what the system could do under command. It hid what it could not do without coercion. As long as belief held, the illusion endured. As long as growth continued, inefficiency remained hidden. But when conditions changed, the system's inability to adjust became visible. The stage was set. The appearance of indestructibility would soon confront the reality of limitation. And when that confrontation arrived, it would expose cracks that had been forming for decades. The real collapse began quietly, long before the flag was lowered or borders were redrawn. It did not start with protests or declarations. It started with stagnation. Factories met targets on paper, while machines aged on the floor. Output numbers looked acceptable, but productivity slipped. Technology lagged behind global standards. The economy still moved, but it moved slowly, like a heavy machine running on worn gears. Central planning, once praised for its precision, could no longer process reality fast enough. Decisions were made using outdated information. By the time orders reached the factory floor, conditions had already changed. Prices told a story that was not true. They did not reflect scarcity or demand. They reflected political decisions. When shortages appeared, prices did not rise to signal imbalance. They stayed fixed. The signal was suppressed. Instead, the cost appeared elsewhere. Lines grew longer. Quality declined. Informal exchanges multiplied. People paid in time, favors, and patience. This hidden cost spread across society. It did not show up in official statistics, but it shaped daily life. Think about that. An economy where the most valuable currency became access. Reports traveled upward through layers of bureaucracy, and at each layer, reality was softened. Managers feared punishment more than failure. Missing a target could end a career. Meeting it, even dishonestly, ensured survival. The rational choice was to falsify. Over time, the system learned to lie to itself. Planners believed production was higher than it was. Leaders believed shortages were temporary. Each distortion compounded the next. The economy became a theater performance where everyone knew the script and pretended the outcome was real. Meanwhile, the state's obligations kept growing. Military spending consumed vast resources. Maintaining parity with rivals required constant investment. New weapons, new systems, new deployments. These costs were non-negotiable. They were tied to prestige and security. At the same time, the state subsidized food, housing, and energy to preserve social stability. These subsidies hid inefficiency. They made everyday life bearable, but they drained budgets. The system paid twice. Once in wasted resources, again in lost incentives. Consumer demand rose as education expanded and expectations changed. People wanted more than survival. They wanted comfort, variety, and choice. The system could not respond. Supply chains were rigid. Production plans were fixed years in advance. Adjusting output required administrative approval at multiple levels. By the time adjustments were authorized, demand had shifted again. The gap widened. Frustration spread. Not anger at first, but fatigue. To bridge the gap, the Soviet state leaned harder on exports of raw materials. Oil and gas became lifelines. Hard currency from these exports funded imports of grain, machinery, and consumer goods. For a time, this worked. Rising global prices masked internal weakness. Revenues flowed. Deficits narrowed. The system postponed reform. But this strategy carried risk. Commodity prices are volatile. They rise and fall beyond any state's control. When prices fell, revenue collapsed. The cushion disappeared. With revenues shrinking, the state faced difficult choices. Cut spending or borrow trust. It chose the latter. Hard currency reserves thinned. External obligations increased. Internally, the system demanded more compliance to compensate for declining performance. This intensified pressure. Surveillance expanded. Discipline tightened. But control cannot create value. It can only redistribute scarcity. The more the state squeezed, the more brittle the system became. Reform emerged not as a bold vision, but as an admission of failure. Attempts to loosen control were cautious and uneven. The goal was to improve efficiency without undermining authority. This balance was impossible. Partial reforms exposed contradictions without resolving them. Once restrictions eased, information flowed. And once information flowed, comparisons became unavoidable. People saw alternatives. They saw how other systems delivered goods and opportunities. The contrast was stark. When prices shifted even slightly, shortages exploded. Subsidies had been holding pressure in place. Removing them released it. Supply could not respond quickly. Distribution networks were unprepared. Panic buying followed. Shelves emptied faster. The system's inability to adapt became visible to everyone at once. This visibility mattered. It transformed private frustration into shared experience. Imagine standing in a factory that employs thousands, knowing its products cannot compete anywhere else. The machines are old. The designs are outdated. The output meets quotas, but no one wants it. Workers know this. Managers know this. Planners know this. Yet production continues because stopping would admit failure. This is a trap. Activity without purpose. Motion without progress. The turning point was psychological as much as economic. Fear had enforced compliance for decades, but fear loses power when belief disappears. Once people stopped believing the system could improve, obedience weakened. Compliance followed inertia, not conviction. When orders conflicted with reality, reality won. This did not produce rebellion overnight. It produced disengagement. Workers showed up, but effort declined. Officials complied, but initiative vanished. The system hollowed further. As central authority weakened, peripheral units asserted autonomy. Local officials improvised and managed shortages. Informal markets expanded. Rules were bent to keep services running. These adaptations stabilized daily life, but they undermined central control. The state relied on uniformity. Deviations signaled decay. Each local solution eroded the coherence of the whole. Power does not disappear all at once. It leaks. It leaks through exceptions, compromises, and workarounds. Each leak seems manageable. Together, they drain authority. The center issues directives. The periphery nods and adjusts them quietly. Over time, the gap between command and execution widens. Eventually, commands become suggestions. The economy's blindness deepened. With distorted data and delayed feedback, policy misfired. Investments went to declining sectors. Resources were allocated based on outdated priorities. Innovation was stifled because it threatened established plans. The system doubled down on what it knew, even as returns diminished. This is how stagnation becomes structural. International conditions amplified internal weakness. As global competition intensified, the cost of inefficiency rose. Technology cycles shortened. Productivity gains elsewhere widened the gap. The Soviet economy, optimized for scale, struggled with speed. Its strength became inertia. Each reform attempt encountered resistance from those who benefited from the existing order. Change threatened status, not just policy. Debt, both financial and psychological, accumulated. Financially, obligations exceeded capacity. Psychologically, promises exceeded credibility. Citizens remembered assurances of improvement. When results failed to appear, skepticism hardened. Words lost power. Announcements were met with silence. This silence was dangerous. It signaled withdrawal. The state responded with more messaging, more explanations, more plans. But plans require trust. Without trust, they sound hollow. The gap between language and lived experience widened further. The system spoke of progress while people experienced decline. This contradiction could not be resolved by decree. At this stage, collapse was not inevitable, but it was increasingly likely. The system faced a narrowing set of options. Deep reform risked instability. Delay guaranteed decline. Leaders hesitated. Each year of hesitation increased the cost of change. The window for gradual adjustment closed. What is striking is how little drama accompanied this phase. No single crisis captured attention. No moment announced the end. Instead, the economy lost momentum. Institutions lost confidence. Society lost patience. The system continued to function, but without direction, like a ship drifting with engines idling. This quiet deterioration explains why the end would later appear sudden. Observers saw the final moments, not the long erosion. They saw declarations and dissolutions, not years of stagnation and misallocation. But the collapse was already written in the numbers that did not add up and the goods that did not arrive. By the time political changes accelerated, the economic foundation was compromised. Authority depended on performance. Performance had stalled. The social contract had frayed. The system could no longer compel belief, and without belief, power became fragile. This chapter is about mechanism, about how economic structure shapes political outcomes. The Soviet Union did not collapse because of a single policy or leader. It collapsed because its economic engine could no longer sustain its ambitions. Control replaced adaptation. Appearance replaced value. And when reality asserted itself, the system lacked the flexibility to respond. The stage was set for the final act. Not a battle, but a dissolution. Not a conquest, but a release. The next chapter will show how, when belief finally gave way, the structure unraveled with surprising speed. By the time the Soviet Union officially ended, the collapse had already happened. The state still existed on paper. Ministries still issued directives. Uniforms were still worn. But authority had drained away. Republics began choosing autonomy over obedience, not through open rebellion, but through quiet disengagement. Local leaders acted first to solve local problems. Then they stopped waiting for approval. Borders hardened without declarations. Laws were reinterpreted. The center spoke, but the periphery no longer listened. Power did not fall. It slipped. Institutions froze as legitimacy vanished. Officials hesitated to enforce rules they no longer believed in. Soldiers waited for orders that never came, or came too late to matter. There was no appetite for violence. Not because force was unavailable, but because belief was gone. Think about that. A state with millions under arms found no one willing to fight for its continuation. Without belief, coercion becomes risky. It exposes weakness, and weakness invites acceleration of collapse. The economy unraveled the same way. Supply chains broke not through sabotage, but through neglect. Payments stalled. Contracts were ignored. Goods stopped moving because no one trusted future settlement. Money lost meaning. Savings evaporated as inflation surged and currencies fragmented. Years of deferred reform were paid for in weeks. This is how economic reckoning works. It is patient until it is sudden. When confidence breaks, adjustment is brutal. Ordinary people bore the cost. Wages failed to keep up. Pensions lost value. Access replaced income as the primary survival tool. Inequality surged as those with connections adapted faster than those without. The safety nets that had justified obedience thinned rapidly. The system had promised protection from uncertainty. Now uncertainty dominated daily life. For many, the collapse did not feel like liberation. It felt like abandonment. What followed was not a single outcome, but many. Some regions stabilized faster. Others descended into prolonged hardship. Assets were redistributed unevenly. Power shifted from institutions to individuals who could navigate chaos. The transition rewarded flexibility, not loyalty. Those trained to follow rules struggled. Those willing to improvise advanced. The social hierarchy inverted. This was not planned. It was emergent. Internationally, the consequences were vast. The balance of power shifted without a decisive conflict. Markets opened abruptly. Alliances dissolved. Formally fixed borders became negotiable. The absence of final battle confused observers. How could such a large system simply end? The answer lies in the nature of collapse. Economies do not fall like buildings. They unravel like fabric. Threads loosen. Tension redistributes. Eventually, the whole structure gives way. The Soviet Union did not lose a war. It lost credibility. With its citizens, with its institutions, with itself. Once credibility was gone, every action was questioned. Every promise sounded empty. Every reform looked insufficient. This loss of credibility explains the speed of the end. When belief dies, continuity becomes impossible. The system did not need to be defeated. It needed to be let go. This is a deeper lesson. Power sustained by force alone is temporary. Systems that suppress feedback lose reality. When information is controlled, mistakes compound. When incentives are distorted, decay accelerates. The Soviet Union was not uniquely flawed. It followed a pattern seen throughout history. Centralized systems can mobilize quickly, but they struggle to adapt. When adaptation is delayed, collapse becomes nonlinear. Modern states still face these risks. Debt can mask instability. Growth can be claimed without value creation. Strength can be projected while resilience erodes. The warning signs are subtle: slowing productivity, rising obligations, declining trust. These do not trigger alarms. They accumulate quietly. By the time they are acknowledged, options are limited. The absence of a final battle should not be reassuring. It should be unsettling. It shows that collapse does not require invasion. It requires disconnection between effort and reward, between promise and delivery, between authority and legitimacy. When those links break, silence replaces conflict. Systems dissolve without resistance. The Soviet experience is not just a historical episode. It is a case study in how economics shapes destiny, not through dramatic crashes, but through long-term misalignment, value ignored, signal suppressed, adaptation delayed. The end feels sudden only because the beginning was ignored. No banners fall when belief dies. No shots are fired. Silence does the work. If this story reshaped how you think about power, collapse, and economics, subscribe for more cinematic history that reveals what textbooks leave out. And share this documentary with others who want to understand how empires really fall.